Hey everyone, this is Mark Bayer, and thanks so much for tuning in to this week's episode of When Science Speaks. It is such a great pleasure to have Lorraine Marchand on the show today. Lorraine is a life sciences consultant, speaker, and educator. She's held executive roles at Bristol Myers Squibb, Covance, and Cognizant Technology Solutions, and currently leads global R&D at IQVIA. She knows the world of startup firsthand, having founded 4 companies. An expert at showing scientists how to communicate the value of their innovations, Lorraine has helped numerous entrepreneurs successfully commercialize their technologies. What is unique about Lorraine? I've invited her to be my guest today because of her proven method for successful innovation. It's based on data-driven problem solving, followed by solution prototyping. And this is what people very often neglect, it's punctuated by Lorraine's specialization in contingency planning and what she has termed the art of the pivot. You never fail, you always learn is one of Lorraine's mantras. And today she's going to share her insights and best practices. And we're really so fortunate to have her with us to do that. Lorraine, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for setting aside the time in your busy schedule to be with us.
Oh, Mark, thank you. It's my pleasure because we're going to be talking about my very favorite topic. So this is an easy one for me to get excited about.
Great. And you are an expert in storytelling and effective communication in the startup environment. And many of our listeners, they're very interested in both of those aspects, how to put together a strong narrative, tell the story in results-oriented, jargon-free language of their research, and then also interested in startups, potentially entrepreneurship. And you combine both of those things. And so I'm wondering if, to start off, you could provide an example of strategic, well-crafted communication of scientific information or technical information, one that sort of is well done and one that's maybe not so successful.
Mark, I get this question a lot, so thank you for the question. And let's look at a couple examples. First, let me use a simple one everyone can relate to. And I'd like to turn things around for just a couple minutes and ask you a question, if that's okay.
Good. Yep.
Mark, what do you like about your smartphone?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things, it actually makes me smarter because I can carry in a small package so much information that, I need at my fingertips, and then just things that, come up that I want to, know a quick answer to. So I know people sort of think of it sometimes as some sort of like peripheral, like a peripheral brain. And I kind of see it that way too. Like in a small package, I can just like have so much information. And that's not even like the phone part, which most people don't even, it's a kind of almost an afterthought. I just love the fact that I'm able to get so much information and keep in touch with people too, I guess, mostly, by text now. But it's just a great compact way to carry with you, just a tremendous, like almost like the biggest libraries in history.
Mark, with that answer, you told us a little bit about who you are, what you care about, and the features and benefits of your phone that matter most. Mm-hmm. Now, let's examine what you didn't say. You didn't open up by saying that you have an iPhone 11 that weighs 6.84 ounces and is 6 by 3 inches in size, with a 6.1 inch screen powered by Apple's new A13 Bio IC chip with 128 gigabytes of storage and dual ultra-wide cameras. Did you?
No, none of that. No, not at all.
Why not?
It's just that to me sounds like so kind of like just dry and like it's not maybe like it's not really results oriented. Like so then the question is like, so what can you do with that stuff? And that's what I care about.
Exactly. The technology description fails to communicate what you love about your phone, what kind of experience it gives you, and why you chose it over competing products and how you use it. Let's look at a life sciences example. Mm-hmm. I want you to listen to these 2 pitches and tell me which one communicates the value and attributes of the technology. Here's number one. My lab has been studying the vitreous proteome for 15 years. We have filed patents on our discovery of 10 biomarkers in the vitreous that we believe are associated with wet macular degeneration. Known as wet AMD, this eye disease causes bleeding in the retina and can eventually lead to blindness. We've developed an assay that demonstrates changes in the levels of these biomarkers before and after the injection into the retina of drugs used to treat this disease. We plan to develop a diagnostic test to predict response and non-response to therapies used to treat this eye disease. Okay, Mark. Did you get all that?
I heard it. I heard some words that I recognized and some that I did not. I know macular degeneration, very, very bad. And so, yes. And then I heard a lot of other things like assays that I don't usually use in general conversation.
Okay. Now, let's try this version of the pitch. 11 million people over age 65, including my mom, have an eye disease called wet AMD, which can eventually cause blindness. Doctors have 5 different drugs to treat wet AMD, but the problem is 70% of patients don't respond to their treatment. And doctors go through a process of trial and error over many years, trying different drugs to see which one works better. Our solution? We've developed a test used in the doctor's office to help determine whether a patient is responding to their therapy so they can get on the drug that works. I'd like to tell you more about how our technology works and how you can help us get it to the market. Mark, what was different about the 2 message tracks?
It really told a story. And I think it's so important. I love it, Lorraine, that, a lot of times scientists, let's just say, because we're talking about this and obviously our audience, they're told to tell a story or a narrative. It's not necessarily like a story from beginning to end, but it follows like what you were describing. First of all, very accessible language and using, vivid types of descriptions that everyone can understand, starting with mom, but also on top of that, talking about, the doctor's office. And I was able to follow you like step by step the entire way, rather than like getting diverted by words I didn't understand and drifting off when you started talking in the first example of some vitreous something or other. That really just didn't, it was way over my head. And so I just I wanted to get to the end, because I was following you every step of the way. I wanted to hear how the story was sort of going to end.
And that is the point. The first example described the research and the technology, but it wasn't until the last sentence that we learned something about the application of the technology, who it was for and why. This is what we call burying our lead. Keep in mind that because of the digital communication world in which we live, the time we now have to capture someone's interest is 7 seconds. 7 seconds for that investor or strategic partner to decide if they want to tune in to our message. In the first example, we used our 7 seconds to communicate that we've been researching the vitreous proteome for 15 years and have filed patents on 10 biomarkers. Is that enough to keep someone's attention? Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah, right.
Now, in the second example, we learned that 11 million baby boomers have a potentially blinding eye disease, including the scientist's mom, so read Skin in the Game, and most don't respond to drugs on the market. We described a problem, we gave it a name, a number, a face, and explained our solution in lay terms. So to sum it up, The way we communicate our scientific advances in a way that's compelling and impactful is to start by describing the problem, the unmet need, in human terms, using numbers and details for impact. Number 2, we explain the solution in simple terms people can understand. The new iPhone lets me take amazing photos, creating memories every day. Or our wet AMD test may help doctors determine who will respond to treatment and who won't, so they can get patients on the drug that will work for them. And third, the ask. Ms. Investor, now that you understand the problem and I've defined our solution, let me tell you how and why you should invest in helping us bring this differentiated technology to market.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What am I supposed to do? Like, what do you want me to do? And it's so interesting too, I have to say, Lorraine, because when I was on Capitol Hill, during a big part of my career, we always needed to know, okay, you've described the problem. Like, what do you want us to do? It's that call to action is just so vital. And it was really interesting and crisp the way that you got to that.
Exactly. The call to action, I couldn't have put it better.
Now, let me ask you this question that follows sort of from the example, okay? And this is something that a question that I get a lot, and I'm really interested. I know it would inform our audience to get your perspective on this, which is, the idea that I want to communicate the real world results of my innovation, but I need to be accurate and I don't want to overhype it. In working in this community of these amazing, talented, inspiring researchers who are really, looking at looking to really push the bounds of what's possible and uncovering and these discoveries. And it's so exciting. At the same time, this training that the same kind of cohort of folks receives is, following the data, don't overhype, maybe use the passive voice, and always leave open the possibility that, what they're working on is not going to turn out the way that they hope. And that sort of leading down that trail. Like, how do you balance that tension?
Well, Mark, we all appreciate that every opportunity has a challenge, every pro a con. Mm-hmm. And it's no different in the business of science. Mm-hmm. While we need to clearly state the benefits of our technology and communicate a reason to believe, we also need to address risks proactively and provide fair balance. Mm-hmm. But we don't stop there, because for every risk, we need to present a mitigation, a contingency, a plan B. So, drawing on our example about the wet AMD diagnostic, after our opening pitch, we acknowledge that our program has some risks. For example, the samples used to date have been from a sample bank of frozen vitreous. Mm-hmm. To get FDA approval for our test, we need to run a prospective clinical trial to demonstrate that the biomarker changes are consistent and the changes are statistically significant in a large sample size. But we're going to manage this risk, right? So we've got the risk, but now we're going to talk about how we're going to mitigate the risk. We're going to manage this risk in the trial by developing a profile of responders and non-responders, and then targeting patient subtypes who we believe will clearly benefit from the test.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Really, really. I mean, you're demonstrating how thoroughly you've got your mind around, your arms around this issue and looking at it from all these different angles. So interesting and so specific and helpful and actionable for listeners. I want to shift a little bit to the next question, which is, this term alternative facts, it was born in 2017. Kellyanne Conway first said those words on Meet the Press, but that the dynamic or the virus, if you will, sometimes I call it that, it's kind of like the latest variant of or mutation of a virus that's been with us for centuries and centuries. But when I talk about that, sort of meaning alternative facts or pre-existing biases, they could be based on incomplete or incorrect data, kind of maybe drawing conclusions from a small data set and kind of applying them more broadly when that's not called for. Do you feel like, and maybe, given your extensive expertise in being in these rooms on both sides and teaching about this, when you, first of all, if you're thinking about an alternative fact as kind of a pre-existing bias that your listener may have, is that, how do you see that as an impediment to innovation? And then how do you recognize that you're in that kind of dynamic, kind of facing that sort of belief system, if you will? And how do you recognize it? And then how do you address it? How do you try to overcome it?
Well, Mark, whenever I'm communicating science or technical content to an audience, especially a lay audience, because as you pointed out, even in my teaching, I often have students who are what I might call tourists of healthcare, medicine, science. Mm-hmm. I first do what I call a perception audit. Mm-hmm. And in a perception audit, I identify what the attitudes, knowledge, biases, perceptions of the audience might be. Mm-hmm. And then I get them into the open at the beginning. Mm-hmm. I work them into the talk. Why? Well, first, by dealing with the perceptions up front, I reduce distractions during the talk or in the Q&A. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the perceptions and biases sound unfounded when you say them out loud, so they lose their sting. Mm-hmm. And secondly, I create, through this method, empathy with the audience. They feel understood, and they're much more tuned in to my explanation or the facts that I'll present. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you an example, a recent example. Mm-hmm. I was giving a talk a day after the coronavirus story broke. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of confusion, misinformation, and hype at the time. Some of the misinformation was around the origin of the virus. And I knew members of the audience had heard rumors that the virus was manufactured in a lab and might be a terrorist tactic. Mm. I opened the talk by pointing to the rumors and speculation. Given we knew so little about the virus, I said it was completely understandable. Mm-hmm. But I then went on to reference the data that the Centers for Disease Control had gathered at that point, isolating the virus to the bats sold in the food markets in Wuhan. I explained animal to human transmission of viruses. I reminded everyone of the SARS outbreak, which is also a coronavirus. Mm-hmm. I then explained how vaccines were developed, why it takes so long. And I could almost see people in the room breathe, relax, nod their heads. Mm-hmm. And afterward, many came forward to thank me for that simple lesson in virus transmission, because I had actually reduced some of their anxiety around this misinformation and some of these misperceptions that had been in the rumor mills. Mm-hmm.
I have to say, Lorraine, that's just, it's so skilled, sophisticated. I mean, it's what I would expect from a person of your caliber. It's so beautiful to hear and elegant to hear you doing that. And underlying what you said, and even the way you described it, is you did all these things with a genuineness, an authenticity, with a taking these as face value without suspending any sort of judgment about them, and getting them out in the open, as you point out, not having them spoken about, having that sort of lose, taking some of the sting out of these things. Just really so well done and brilliant, I have to say. And then of course you got this response. And I think, just underlying it, the sort of empathy that you were showing as far as taking these concerns seriously, must have gone a long way.
Well, I do believe, Mark, that when you display empathy and people feel understood, you have a much better opportunity of having a dialogue, of having influence over them, and having a more positive outcome. So,
Yeah, really, really, really smart. People need to feel heard. And that can be, that's really a prerequisite that often is ignored. I'm just going to dictate to you, or maybe even imply how stupid these things, these are crazy, conspiracy theories. And perhaps they sort of may be, but you have to really take them seriously to open up that channel, as you pointed out.
Exactly. Otherwise, you have people sort of challenging you throughout the talk, and you just don't have their attention because you haven't been able to kind of settle their mind and recognize and honor the view that they have, whether it's misguided or not. They still need to be recognized.
Really, and thank you for that example. So important. Now, you're a veteran of launching companies to kind of move to your leadership in the entrepreneurial world. And so, what are the essentials that you feel every entrepreneur should know, should be doing, and if possible, things that she should be avoiding in starting a company?
Sure. So, Mark, the essentials that every entrepreneur needs to know in starting a company. First and foremost, you need to start with a feasibility. And the feasibility is an assessment of the risks of your technology, the financial risks, and the market risk. Those are the main large categories. And after an honest assessment of those risks, the entrepreneur needs to make a go or a no-go decision. And so I think that that's sort of the first inflection point, is to really understand those risks and determine whether it makes sense to continue with a pursuit of this technology and trying to transition it into a company. Not always easy to do, but that's essential. Secondly, and entrepreneurs, especially scientist entrepreneurs, oftentimes make this mistake. You have to have a strong management team. And that management team has to have a track record of success. So I think the physician scientist has to keep that principle of staffing to your weaknesses in mind. And knowing that while you have the scientific acumen, you likely don't have market investing, financial, regulatory acumen, and you have to find the best talent to bring into your entity or into your project so that you are taking as much benefit as you can of having a very talented, well-rounded team, and preferably one that has been down this road before and has been successful. So that's number 2. Number 3, and again, I see physician entrepreneurs make this mistake too, but having experienced this myself, my guidance is to raise as much money as you can early on. Too many entrepreneurs are afraid of giving away too much equity early on, and they therefore undercapitalize their enterprise and then find they can't raise the money later. And we have so many examples of that happening around the 2010 recession, depression that we had, when the markets were very much opened up, going into 2010. A lot of entrepreneurs held back on maximizing that. And then we went into the valley of death for several years, and we really saw a spike in the number of ventures that just were not able to get the capital to move forward. So you always have to evaluate the pros and the cons, but my guidance is get the capital while you can.
One question about this, and really such valuable advice, Lorraine. In the early stages, when you are looking, as you point out, You really should be raising as much capital as possible. On the other side, you explain why people can sometimes be hesitant to do that. Are there ways of, so would an idea sort of be to try to raise the capital without sort of the dilution, maybe going after grants or other programs, funding through other federal programs, for example, or other things that don't require equity in exchange?
Yes, absolutely. You want to go from the mildest form of capital or the non-dilutive forms of capital up the ladder, if you will. So to the extent that you can apply for small business innovation grants from the NIH or the DoD or the other federal agencies, that you have high net worth individuals in your circles, or if not high net worth individuals, family and friends who are willing to be early angel investors. Those are obviously the first two forms of capital raise that you want to try to achieve because they have non-dilutive, or at least with the angel investing, mildly dilutive impact on you. Once you get up and running, if you're successful, then you're going to need to transition to venture capital and the various levels of venture capital. And but yes, you can progress on this ladder in a way that is phased and tranched and appropriate for the growth of your enterprise and also feels comfortable to you.
Sure. So that I really love how you added that in the end, because that is so important. You've given us so much actionable information and specific information, and I'm wondering in the next question, is there anything, just thinking about communicating your message to investors, now taking that sort of tranche of the communications part of the audience, segment, that audience segment, let's put it that way. Is there anything that you think either bears re-emphasis from what you talked about previously, or maybe something that's a little bit different in degree or kind, sort of when you're talking about messaging to investors in particular?
Yes, and some of it's going to reinforce some of the messages that we've already discussed. But in terms of talking to investors, number one, remember that investors are looking for a commercially viable product that the market wants, that a buyer will pay for. And they want to see a business plan that minimizes exposure to financial, technical, and market risk. Number two, they want to see a solid technology that is solving a real problem based on research with the key stakeholders. I always tell my students, we don't do innovation in a vacuum sitting in the office. We need to get out and talk to at least 100 customers or other stakeholders that are going to be impacted by our technology in order to prove its merit and to prove that we have somebody who wants our solution. And importantly, that decision maker or that buyer needs to be willing to spend money to fix the problem. And they need to want to spend money on your solution, at least potentially. Really, really important. If you ask somebody if you'd like this feature or this app on the iPhone, they'll say sure. If you ask them the question, are you willing to spend $50 a month for this feature or this app on your cell phone, you might get a different response. And number three, we talked about securing a management team that has succeeded before. And one of the reasons that I emphasize this is because after the solidness of the technology and the de-risking, the second thing that investors look for that's the most important to them is investors like management teams who've had a series of successes. So they're going to look at the talent and the track record of the team. And four, be objective and pragmatic. Physician entrepreneurs need to demonstrate that they're not in love with their technology and expect some kind of crazy valuation.
Right.
Yeah.
It's so I mean, that's a syndrome that you could totally see, happening, just generally at all levels. It's just becoming, you're so close to it. It's the answer. But as you say, like getting out there, and even that question, as you're saying, it's sort of like, well, it was interesting. I on the show, we have an interview from a few months ago with Dr. Christy Canaria at the I-Corps program at NIH. And as a requirement for I-Corps funding, if you make it through the process and you actually get the funding, you need to do at least 100 interviews. And just exactly for the reason that you stated. And I love how you underline the fact that it's not just this could be like a nice to have. Sure, you're like, yeah, that sounds good. But it's really like you're gonna give me your credit card number right now, to charge this to your account. Then you start to see some, maybe a little bit of a different demand curve.
Yes, absolutely. And investors are going to ask you for that market research and those proof points.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Lorraine, I want to ask you as we wrap up our interview, this is not easy stuff. I mean, you obviously are a clear expert on this and are really helping other entrepreneurs understand how to do this. So why do you think it's so hard to make the leap from research to building a successful company? I think you've talked about these items during the course of our conversation. But this is not an easy thing to do, as you know firsthand, as a founder of 4 companies, building 4 companies too. What can scientists do to increase their odds of success?
Well, Mark, we hear about the failure rates, for example, in drug development, or most startups, really any science or technology-based startup, that only 1 out of 10 will actually succeed, right? So 9 out of every 10 new technologies are going to fail. We hear numbers from the Tufts Center for Research on Drug Development telling us that $2.3 billion is what's required to bring a new drug to the market. And that figure, of course, is based on risk or all of the failures. Mm-hmm. So we're very much in an industry that has profound and persistent uncertainty. And in science, and especially in biologic science, because it involves human beings and differences in responses to therapies, that's coupled with long time frames and large investments. Mm-hmm. So big investments, high risk, high reward, but it's not for the faint of heart. The other aspect of this is that there is the need to learn rapidly, right? So we talk about knowledge transfer, continuous process improvement, the ability to learn and incorporate those learnings. And I like to talk about the art of the pivot, so you can change direction, very quickly and easily and fastly. But in the development process of so many technologies, it can take a while for the research to come in, for the science to clarify itself, for us to really understand the evidence. And so it's difficult and challenging to respond quickly to new information in order to keep the asset relevant and to pivot in a new direction as needed. And sometimes we find that the market passes us by, the competition gets ahead of us. So there's a whole timing issue in how quickly we can sort of assimilate new learnings and new findings and respond to that information. That certainly is a second dimension of the challenge. And then finally, and there's been a lot written about this, we're trying to integrate capabilities and competencies across science and business. Mm-hmm. And these are very, very different cultures. Science is based on data, it's based on evidence, peer review, a lot of patience until, the data is right or we feel as though we can action it. We have to look at safety, we have to look at regulatory, first do no harm. And business is just about the opposite. Business can be gut oriented. It can be emotional. It can be irrational. We look at the capital markets in response to the coronavirus, and we all have to agree that there's some level of irrationality, in all of that. Everybody's impatient for the information to come forward. They want to make their return in 3 to 5 years. They want to get to market so that they can be competitive. So trying to get these two cultures integrated and aligned is also a challenge. And I do know that physician scientists, sometimes are challenged and struggle with the commercial or the market side of trying to bring their new invention to market. So, I think it's one of the reasons why we have a model that's emerged, which is about allowing the academic innovations to be partnered at a pretty early stage with strategic corporates and other entities that can help to share the risk, bear the risk. They bring, big dollars and big capabilities in order to navigate regulatory hurdles or to open up new markets. And I think that's, really a very good model. So I think that the sooner physician entrepreneurs can recognize and appreciate the fact that it's their scientific acumen that starts this technology down the path, and at an appropriate time, it makes a lot of sense to try to bring in that right partner who can take it to market. Those innovators and entrepreneurs seem to have higher success rates than those who, again, for different reasons, are in love with the idea of building a company, no matter whether it makes sense for the technology or the environment that they're currently in.
Well, Lorraine Marchand, I feel like you've given us a masterclass in entrepreneurship, business, the business of healthcare, biotech, where scientists, entrepreneurs need to go, what they should be mindful of, all in a very compressed time frame, which kind of underlines one of your areas, one of your really strong talents, which is being able to distill and explain, and kind of ending where you sort of started, which is explaining in such accessible, energetic, results-focused language, all of these items that I mentioned. It just was so wonderful to have you share that knowledge and really, have people understand kind of the level that they could maybe aspire to when they're trying to explain and in the process that they should think about if they're interested in entrepreneurship or just in talking about their research to general audiences.
Well, Mark, it's my pleasure. I hope that it's been helpful. And even if one scientist, entrepreneur is able to take some of this information and translate it and move their ideas forward, I would be pleased. My mission is absolutely focused on advancing health and trying to bring new innovations to market and really creating an environment where scientists, entrepreneurs can be successful. So it's absolutely been my pleasure to join you for this discussion. So thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you, Lorraine. And thank you, listeners, for being with us on this episode of When Science Speaks. Information about Lorraine's work and how to reach out to her on LinkedIn and so forth will be in the show notes. I hope you'll be back next week for another episode of When Science Speaks. That was so awesome.